I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss Boris Johnson and his first prime ministerial trip abroad outside of the UK borders. He went to Germany and France, but to, of course, discuss Brexit and the chaos that has ensued since that vote took place in the UK a number of years ago. It doesn't seem that he's really come to any conclusion that is specific about the Irish border backstop, which is the main issues that he sees with the current Brexit deal as it currently stands. That Brexit deal has, as you well know, 3 times already been rejected by the UK Parliament. Merkel has been misquoted, according to her, saying that she's given 30 days for the UK to come up with an alternative plan, saying that she just said that within 30 days, if the UK were able to resolve that issue, that would be fine. Emmanuel Macron, I should say, France's president, was a lot less forgiving, saying that this was all the UK's own fault, essentially. I'm paraphrasing, of course, saying that going forward, it would be the UK that would need to figure out a way out of all of this, saying that, again, that the EU was preparing for a no-deal Brexit scenario, as well as is Boris Johnson, very clearly. Let's discuss all of this a bit further and the ramifications of this trip. We're now joined by Professor Thom, who is a professor of law and government and the dean of Durham University's Law School. He's joining us now from Durham. We're now joined by Dr. Benjamin Martill as well. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Derendorf Forum, which is based at LSE Ideas. He's also the co-editor of the volume Brexit and Beyond, Rethinking the Futures of Europe, and he's joining us now from London. Thom and Benjamin, thank you both for taking your time to join us today here in Scope. Thom, I wanted to start with you. What did you make of Boris Johnson's trip abroad to Germany and France? Has he in any way been successful about trying to renegotiate the deal that exists?
My suspicion was, he had to make a overture. He sent a letter to Merkel and to Macron saying, basically setting out the same old ideas on alternative arrangements to them, nothing new in that letter. And I suspect that his perhaps his hope was that they would say no, and then he could begin pointing the finger at the EU for why he was struggling to make any progress and why no deal was becoming close to a certainty. Instead, I think Merkel...
Indeed, on that point, Thom, actually, do you think that was actually the goal from the get-go? Because many people would wonder, Thom, why go to Germany and France instead of just going to Brussels or even possibly Dublin? Because it seems that at the least, the issue of the backstop is one which directly affects the Republic of Ireland, doesn't it?
Yes, but I don't think Boris Johnson wants to start a fight with the Republic of Ireland. I think he'd rather point a finger at France and Germany in the heart of the EU geographically, instead to meet some political objective. So that's why I think he went there. I mean, one might also ask, why in the world did Theresa May never discuss Brexit planning with her cabinet? Why did she never show them anything until only a few months before it went to Parliament? And why did she stick to her guns 3 times, knowing she was going to lose each of those votes? I mean, so much of this has been very difficult to see the sense or the logic as to why the different actors have been doing what they've done. However, I think that while Boris has been trying to put a brave face on this, he's being told by Merkel, at least, that he has this period of time to come up with some new plan for alternative arrangements, none of which he seems to have. So I think it's put the ball back in his courts, and I think the finger will be pointed now at him for failures of moving forward.
That's interesting. Benjamin, do you agree with that? Because again, there are some analysts, at least what I read online, saying that this may have been Boris Johnson's plan from the get-go, a divide and conquer possibly the EU, which obviously he has not succeeded on, dividing even Germany and France from each other on this issue of Brexit. But secondly, trying to find a scapegoat for why possibly the UK would still leave without a deal on October 31st.
Well, to be honest, I don't think there's there's much disagreement between us. I think it's very clearly the case. I mean, the UK has tried divide and rule before. In a sense, it's the routine that the UK would always try to go back to. It tended to work in previous rounds of EU treaty negotiations because the UK was a member and a powerful member. But of course, the game has fundamentally changed now. The Europeans, the EU 27, have a fundamental interest in safeguarding the autonomy of their legal system and the European model. And the UK getting a good deal would be a threat to that. So I think divide and rule hasn't worked for precisely that reason. We've never seen the EU 27 more united, and they've been very clever in delegating authority for conducting the negotiations to the Commission and to Barnier, precisely to stop the UK trying to divide and rule. And the real, of course, the surprising thing is why Boris would think that he can he can have any more success than Theresa May did, even though he's in almost exactly the same structural situation.
But then I imagine, Benjamin, at some level, doesn't it reflect badly EU if a Brexit occurs without a deal? And secondly, a no-deal Brexit affects the EU negatively too, doesn't it?
True. Well, but you have to remember the EU was very clear in granting the extension to Article 50. The rationale was that it didn't want to be seen to be blamed for a no-deal Brexit. And in a sense, if it's probably the Court of World Public Opinion will suggest that it's the obstinacy of the UK to blame for a no-deal Brexit, especially since that's the tune that successive governments have been singing for a long time. No deal is better than a bad deal, and Boris Johnson says something very similar. And don't forget that the effects of a no deal are very asymmetric. So the UK government likes to say that the EU will lose from a no deal Brexit, of course, but the UK will lose far more, and that affects the bargaining power in these negotiations.
Yeah. Okay. So, Thom, I'm wondering, why have we come to this point now when the UK, has Boris Johnson as Prime Minister? And I know that sounds very crude as a statement to make, but one does wonder, sitting outside the UK, why things have gotten this bad when it comes to this entire Brexit chaos. Why have governing officials, why have officials in either party, really, be it even the Brexit party, really, why haven't we all been able to come to some agreement to at least make all of this a smooth transition out?
We're in this situation because there was a coalition government in 2010 that David Cameron, then Prime Minister, didn't like. He had seen a lot of the Tory votes eroded to a group called UKIP, led by Nigel Farage, and he wanted to nip them in the bud and run a conservative-only government. In the following election, 2015, David Cameron promised a referendum. A referendum he wanted to win. He wanted to keep the UK in the EU, but the purpose was 100% to kill off UKIP in order to shore up the Conservative vote share and to not be in a coalition with anybody. When David Cameron won a surprise majority in 2015, he then moved very swiftly to call the referendum, hoping that he could kind of draw a line under this and crack on with his program. It clearly didn't work at all. Not having much time to put a referendum together led to a very poorly coordinated Remain campaign, whereas the forces who were against the EU have been against it for decades. And they also were very clever in how they managed themselves. There's a lot more we could say about that, but there was a dysfunction. I wonder
on that point of dysfunction, Thom. One of the things I've always wondered when it comes to Brexit is why did Theresa May take over at the time that she did? Because it's been said that she was a Remainer before the vote happened. That's at least what's been said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But then why not just give the helm to Boris Johnson? Because he's always been on the leave side. He's always wanted out of the EU. And he's remained very consistent on that point. And why not just give the helm to somebody like that who is so, gung-ho about the issue?
Well, I think to be fair to Boris Johnson, which I'm not usually, he had been pro-EU for quite some time, right up until around the time of deciding to go back the other side. He had a kind of a spectacular U-turn. But you ask a very good question. Why Theresa May? Why not others? Well, a simple reason was that Boris Johnson chose not to be a leader or not try to run to be leader of the Conservative Party. Other candidates who had supported Leave in the referendum just simply didn't have support of their own colleagues to take over. And so it fell to Theresa May simply because it never came to a vote. Others fell out of the way as they were trying to choose a leader.
Okay, so Benjamin, if I may, Thom, I want to put that same question to Bex. Again, I want to get your thoughts on that, Benjamin. Why not have Boris Johnson be in power from day one after Cameron left, obviously, since that Brexit vote happened? Because it would make sense, wouldn't it, to have somebody who is that strongly opinionated on the side of the vote to take the helms and move this process forward. I mean, it seems like Boris Johnson's come into all of this very late.
Well, I think so. I mean, you have to think about what the interests were at the time. So Theresa May was chosen because she was a good unity candidate. I mean, the Tories have a very big problem in a sense in that they are fundamentally divided between individuals who are pro and anti-EU, depending on whether you're talking about the MPs or the members or the various constituencies that support the party. Theresa May was seen as a good unity candidate because she was quite quiet in the referendum, even though she formally backed remaining in the EU. She also was very clear to point out how much she disliked the European Court of Human Rights, and so was seen as a very sort of she was seen as a leader who would be more on the right. In terms of what you say about Boris Johnson, I mean, in a way, I think things would have been easier if he'd taken over straight away, because I feel that so much of the present impasse we're in at the moment is down to Theresa May essentially being an insecure leader, in that she felt constantly that she had to demonstrate her credentials as a hard sort of Brexiteer, as it were. And this is why we got into a lot of problems with, for instance, the UK triggering Article 50 very quickly before it knew what it wanted. This is why we have the problem with Theresa May having coming out with a lot of sort of very pro-Brexit phrases and coming up with very hard red lines, but then sort of behind everyone else's back negotiating something, which came out in the Chequers Agreement, which looked much more like what she'd promised never to deliver, which was, Brexit in name only, or, sort of membership through the back door. And so I think a lot of the problems now were that the leader at the time wasn't a credible Brexiteer. But then, of course, as Thom has said, neither is Johnson. I mean, he's a political chameleon in that sense.
Indeed. Okay, we'll leave that as a final word, Benjamin and Thom, but of course we appreciate your time. And certainly I know that we'll be looking, as you will as well, at the G7 summit that is coming up, and of course, very closely at that October 31st deadline also. But we appreciate your time this morning speaking to us there from the UK with Thom and Benjamin, sharing their thoughts with us about Boris Johnson's trip to Germany and France. Seemingly he hasn't come away with anything concrete as he may have hoped, or maybe he didn't hope for it. Maybe he is looking for a scapegoat, if some reports are to be believed and some experts' opinions are to be believed. But certainly, the October 31st deadline is still coming up. Boris Johnson sticking by that deadline, saying that whether there is a deal in place or there is no deal in place, the UK will still leave the EU on that day. What does that mean for the EU and the UK? There have been obviously many fatalistic forewarnings about what this means for the UK economy and even possibly the EU economy. And then, of course, there's that very sensitive issue of the Irish backstop at the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is a sensitive issue at many levels, not just about customs union, et cetera. And we'll keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, on Tuesday, a number of powerful blasts rocked a position of the Popular Mobilization Units. They are a paramilitary group within Iraq, claimed that, of course, that they are pro-Iran and supported by Iranian forces and commanders, as well as weapons and ammunition and otherwise as well. The PMUs, as they're known, have blamed Israel as well as the United States. The U.S. controls, to an extent, of course, Iraqi airspace. The Israeli drones, according to the PMU commander, four Israeli drones entered into Iraqi airspace to be able to carry out a number of these attacks on PMU positions and military bases within the country. This is not the first time, certainly, that the PMUs have come under attack. They've come under attack by, again, they allege Israel as well within Syria also. Is the U.S. allowing the Israelis to attack Iraqi positions at this time. This is something that Pompeo had warned about back in January. But this would obviously be a huge escalation since actually the Israelis have not attacked Iraqi positions since 1981, I believe it is, when they attacked an under construction nuclear facility at that time. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're now joined by Kawa Hassan, who is the Vice President of Middle East and North Africa Program at the East-West Institute. He's joining us now from Brussels. We're also joined by Ali Mamouri, who is the editor of the Iraq Pulse at the Al Monitor and former lecturer at the University of Sydney and University of Tehran. He's joining us now from Sydney. Ali and Kawa, thank you both for joining us. Ali, I wanted to start with you, if I may. What do you make of these attacks on the PMU positions?
Yeah, look, this is like several attacks that is happening in the recent weeks. It started from early July. The last one was early this week, which was the fourth or the fifth one. We had one in Amerli in Salahuddin province, another one in Ashraf camp in Diyala, both of them in western Iraq. We had another one in southern Baghdad last week, which was a huge explosion resulting in one dead and several injuries. The last one was in around Balad Air Base, which is a very strategic military base in northern Iraq, and resulted also in destroying a lot of PMU weapons. Generally, PMU are divided in two different parts. They are not one united entity. We have several factions gathering under this name. Yeah. A few of them belong to Iran completely, and they are targeted by the recent attacks. The majority of them, they have nothing to do with these attacks.
Okay, so Kawa, why would anybody want to attack the PMU bases? And if it is Israel, why would Israel want to attack them?
Thank you, Waqar. Thanks for having me. I mean, it's obvious that these attacks are part of the wider regional, tension between, on the one hand, Iran, and on the other hand, U.S. and Israel. So, as you rightly said, these are the first attacks since 1981. So it's really alarming because Iraqi, stability is quite fragile. After the weakening of ISIS since 2017, there has been some gains, particularly in the area of security. Security has improved, even though ISIS is still quite, strong and has sleeper cells and, engaged in attacks. But by and large, security has improved, and people feel that. On other fronts like economic reconstruction, fighting corruption, very little has happened. So what has been, the main gain has been a fragile stability and fragile security. Now the conflict between Iran and U.S. and Israel, is now having an impact on Iraqi stability, and we should, see these attacks within the wider conflict in the region.
Ali, I wonder, how much this has to do with that. If I'm not mistaken, just a few weeks ago, in fact, I had done a show on how the PMUs were now going to be coming into the Iraqi army where they were now going to become part of proper Iraqi forces, not just as separate entities within the country. And of course, the PMUs have asked, I believe, for an extension of the deadline at that time. But nevertheless, that's the process that the Iraqi government wants to happen as soon as possible, certainly. Why then time these attacks for this moment? Because it seems odd if the PMUs were now to become a part of the Iraqi forces. This is an odd time then to attack them, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. This is actually a big challenge for Iraqi state. It started from former Iraqi Prime Minister Haydar Abadi. He started this process in 2015, but the process was very slow because this part of PMU, which belong to Iran, are refusing completely to join the Iraqi state and getting under the control of the prime minister. I think this is some kind of silent cooperation or non-written cooperation between a part of Iraqi government and the U.S. to help them to force PMU to get under the control of the government. That's why exactly this part of PMU that refusing this process are targeted. Other parts like Abbas Combat Division, they are located in Saudi border, Iraqi-Saudi border in the south, or other like Atabad Division, like other parts that are belong more to Sistani or to the state, or even Muqtada Sadr militia, Sarai as-Salam, they are not targeted at all, and there is nothing against them at all. Another indication for what I just said is that there is no strong position from Iraqi government about it. The only strong position about it was from Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the deputy head of PMU, which exactly a few hours after his statement that he blamed Israel, the head of PMU, Faleh al-Fayyaz, which is more close to the prime minister and is close to the US as well, issued a statement and said Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis' opinion statement is his personal opinion and is not representing the PMU. PMU still are doing the investigation and they are not blaming any party so far.
Nevertheless, as you correctly there said, Ali, there is criticism of the Iraqi government's role in all this. And Kawa, Ahmad al-Hakim also released a statement, and part of it says that the government has been silent and needs to expose the perpetrators. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. He said that we have had enough of condemnations. He said these attacks are a serious violation of our national sovereignty, Iraqi sovereignty, that is. Do you agree with that? Does the government need to be stronger in this case and let the US and Israel or whoever really is behind these attacks know that this is unacceptable?
Well, I think Iraqi government is really in a very, difficult position right now. It tries to assert its authority, but at the same time, it's caught between, in between this conflict between Iran, US, and Israel. And the Iraqi prime minister issued decrees to, as Ali said, to restructure and reintegrate PMUs in the Iraqi army. And he gave them 2 months deadline. Now they asked for more, 2 months more to implement that decree. We'll see whether that will be really implemented. So the Iraqi government, prime minister, president, and also the head of, the speaker of parliament yesterday, they met and reiterated, the fact and their willing, their hope that Iraq to be shielded away from this conflict. But internally, as I said, Iraqi prime minister doesn't have so far much control on certain parts of PMU, as Ali said. And others, they understand other, factions. They do understand the fragile position of the Iraqi government. But the Iraqi prime minister is right now in a very difficult position, and time will tell whether he will manage to, on the one hand, convince U.S. and Israel, or at least U.S. and that U.S. on its part to try to put pressure on Israel not to go ahead with these attacks, and whether also he will manage to convince Iran to rein in those elements which are quite close to Iran, not to provoke Israel and U.S. Time will tell. For the time being, I think Iraqi government is struggling to assert its authority.
Okay, so Ali, as that meeting that Kawa mentioned, what's been announced from that is that the Iraqi Prime Minister has canceled all special flight permissions, I should say, for Iraqi and foreign aircraft, including sorties by the US-led coalition, which is fighting against ISIS, that those must be cleared in advance by him directly. Is that enough, or do you think that Ahmad al-Hakim or others are correct that the Iraqi government has been too silent, it's been too muted in response to such a violation?
Of course, it's not enough, because the attack so far as reported was done by drones and the drones coming most likely from outside of Iraq, and is not organized by the coalition, and no one can stop them. This is, as my colleague said, should be seen in the big picture. The attack is similar to the attack against Saudi by Yemen's Houthis, which the drone traveling from either Iraq one time, the other time from Yemen to Saudi, and bombed some areas like Hotline and etc. So same with Iraq. The drones are coming from outside of the border, and it's not easy to blame any part that you are organizing that. For sure, it's not U.S., because U.S. knows that its position in Iraq is very sensitive. They can't do a big problem like that because they will be targeted by the PMU. PMU several times targeted U.S. interests. They didn't have any causality, but anyway, they tried to send a message.
But then at the same time, Ali, you know, as you well know, in January, when Mike Pompeo was visiting Iraq, he did say that Israel may very well launch attacks against the PMUs and that the U.S. would not stop those attacks. That was significant, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But for this position, U.S. can say that I'm not involved, as they already said. Okay. And it's not my responsibility. If you want to do anything, go and talk with Israelis or go attack Israel if you can. And they know that Iraq doesn't have this possibility and facility to do that.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a final word. The clock is best of us, gentlemen, but we appreciate both Kawa and Ali for their time today, sharing their thoughts with us, of course, on this important topic. The PMU issue is one that is sensitive, of course. The Iraqi government wants them to come into the fore, the Iraqi forces more specifically. That process has seemingly already begun, even though the PMUs have asked for a 2-month extension. You'll remember that I did a show on that not too long ago about that process beginning at the very least and the call for that extension by the PMUs. Nevertheless, an attack within Iraqi territory on any military base or any facility really by any external player is obviously not helpful and is obviously against the national sovereignty of that country, as Ammar al-Hakim, one of the Iraqi politicians, a very significant one certainly in the country, has pointed out. But again, as Ali and Kawa there said, we have to look at the macro picture here as well of these quote-unquote proxy wars throughout the region that are playing out. And Iraq has repeatedly said it does not want to be a part of this U.S. versus Iran or Israel versus Iran back and forth in the region. It wants to just get on with the business of governing and fixing its own country, since years of occupation and war have destroyed it. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation there in Iraq here in Scope. I'll be back though with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, Twitter and Facebook initially made the decision to suspend and even ban some accounts on their platforms respectively. And just today, YouTube has also decided to suspend some accounts as well. And when I mean some, these are significant numbers of accounts, 900 plus Twitter accounts, and Facebook removing 7 pages, 3 groups, and 5 accounts, and YouTube also removing, I believe, around 100 or so accounts as well. Now, the accusation is that these accounts are pro-China, even though Google, which of course owns YouTube, has not put that forth. All of this has to do with the Hong Kong protests, specifically these platforms saying that those accounts spread misinformation about the Hong Kong protests. Now, on the other side, of course, the Chinese would claim that, listen, these accounts were actually accounts by people, A, run by normal people, and secondly, they were showing rioting and violence by those protesting on the streets there in Hong Kong for their several reasons and grievances that they have there. Let's discuss this further, because it's significant, isn't it, that these platforms would make this decision at such a sensitive time there in Hong Kong, and essentially seemingly are taking a side when it comes to that political issue. Is that a good thing for any social media platform to be involved in? We're now joined by Jamie Mulholland, who is a geopolitical analyst and China specialist. He's also op-ed writer for China Internet Information Center and has contributed to the International Poverty Reduction Center in China and the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute. He's joining us now from London. We're also joined by Moundhir Sajjad Bechari, who is a geopolitician and China expert. He's a Sinophile and expert on geopolitical issues related to East Asia and the Middle East. He's based in Beijing, but he's joining us now from London. Moundhir and Jamie, thank you both for joining us. Moundhir, I wanted to start with you. What do you make of these suspensions/bans of these accounts? Twitter and Facebook came out very clearly and said, listen, the Chinese government is behind these accounts. The Chinese government, of course, saying, no, this is all run by normal people. Why would you say that just because they're critical of the Hong Kong protests? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, what I think is that we have to be careful and be cautious on how we interpret what is happening right now. History has been showing us with the digitalization of the era that we are facing, there's a lot of careful measure that we have to apply regarding social medias. The Arab Spring hitting Tunisia, Egypt, and so on have shown that when social media, such as Twitter or Facebook, which started from the US, have to be read from more than one perspective. The problem here with the Hong Kong protests, it shows that it seems to have a certain bias. I'm not saying that what they did is right or what is wrong. I'm just saying here that we cannot apply one restriction from one side and letting the other side constantly using this way to manufacture consensus, manufacture opinion, indirectly speaking, because this is today maybe the source of news where the whole world gets from, the most at least.
Indeed, and that's an important point, Jamie, because it seems, again, on the outside that there's only one side that these platforms may want to be getting that sort of voice. Are we reading too much into it, do you think?
It's it's very complicated. Every government has a digital media strategy. These platforms try to remain neutral, although they are U.S. owned, and this could be seen as pressure from the U.S. government or U.S. interest groups. We saw this kind of actions taken against Russia, but there's no mention of the NRA using these platforms, or of the fact that every government has a digital media strategy. So when you look at what the statement is that there will be no new rules that apply to government media but not to tax-funded state media. Well, what's the difference between tax-funded state media and state media? It's all funded by the state, and a lot of states have a significant influence in the media. So where do you draw the line between propaganda and bad propaganda?
And one of the things, Moundhir, which was interesting that came up as I was researching this, and I was in Iran in 2009 when the protests occurred there after the re-election issue that occurred there between Ahmadinejad and Mir Hossein Mousavi. At that time, Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at that time, actually praised Twitter for postponing a server upgrade for 24 hours to allow for tweets that were being put up through its platform about the Iranian protests, and then said that this was a model of U.S. diplomacy in the internet age. So in many ways, Moundhir, do you think we're actually in the midst of also, when we speak about an information war, that we're actually also in the midst of an online information war specifically?
Well, this is actually the war, the conflicts, or the main issue and challenge of tomorrow. We are in 2019 in an era that is so disruptive and that shows cleavages and gap of social development interpreted under the scope of the access to digitalization. When it comes to countries that were historically against or in opposition towards a certain strong U.S. narrative or presences or involvement or interference in a certain region of the world, we have seen that those what we call today ways of conducting public diplomacy that started strongly with U.S. administration have not, whether first of all, not being efficient, second of all, extremely biased and are literally conducting an US/Western-centric agenda into complicated regions that do not have the full understanding and the full command of those social media, because social media at that particular time, 2009, 2011, and 13, with the Arab Spring and so on, was something representative of certain social classes that whether understand it very well, or whether they are becoming, whether the victims or following social medias that were highly influenced by external forces, whether it's a religious fanatism or whatsoever. Therefore, we have to understand here what is it. Is that this idea of digitalizing our whole entire society and a way to speak and so on have been emerging new different challenges that most of people are not able to fully read.
Indeed, and Jamie, it's it's not lost on me that we're using social media right now to speak to both of you, but I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because it does seem like this information war is becoming that much tougher then to see beyond these biases that these platforms have, doesn't it?
There's a much greater issue with bots retweeting and commenting on other posts. And you see this with Brexit. You saw this with the Trump election. You see this after mass shootings in the US, where somebody will make a comment about, oh, we should have, stronger gun protections, or we should, stay in the EU. And then all of a sudden, there can be 100 comments countering this, providing alternative information. And I think that's a much more insidious threat that not everybody can be aware. As we get better with artificial intelligence and deep fake, there will start to be, you could find a clip of yourself saying something very different online, and people would struggle to tell the difference. And these platforms say, oh, it's so complicated. There's so many people we can do. And then they said, oh, in a few weeks, we shut down 200,000 accounts. Yeah. So it seems that it's very difficult when it's inconvenient. And when there's a lot of pressure and they feel that, they'll get a lot of praise and there's an advantage, then suddenly it becomes possible.
Yeah. Moundhir, Moundhir, I wonder what your thoughts are as somebody, who's based in Beijing yourself. I wonder, do you think that when it comes to just not just online media, but even just mainstream media, do you think that the media worldwide has actually been quite skewed against China when it comes to this issue of Hong Kong?
Well, when it comes to the issue of Hong Kong, or to other issues or whatsoever they want to put as issue, there's a strong narrative against China, whether the channel that we are using and the way they are, the linguistic that they put into it, there's always this rhetoric, this strong Western rhetoric, or let's say, with not antagonizing Western, let's say any kind of countries that see the hegemony being threatened, that they need to antagonize China and let's say this caricature and stereotype of being an oppressive regime. Well, then if we have to define what is oppressive regime, then they also have to define their own oppressive regimes that is more disguised under different, let's say, makeup and tools that is harder to read. When it comes to the idea of Hong Kong, there is definitely, when we look at all the mainstream medias around the world, China is portrayed as being the oppressor constantly. Well, again, here we have to see that Hong Kong has been always this window to China from a Western point of view, using all these Western-based beings that have been founding the city for over decades, and has been highly influenced by this UK presences from a land that was stolen by China from China after the Opium War. So again, it's all about putting everything in the right balance and the right spectrum, and seeing where this idea of oppression really benefits which agenda or which person or entities in the process.
Indeed, that's the important point, isn't it? It's not about just having an opinion one way or the other, but it's about having the proper context of any situation, isn't it? And it's why would these platforms, in your opinion, not want any person out there to have the proper full picture of an issue as complex as Hong Kong?
Well, I think on social media, there's an inherent desire to get likes, to get shares, to get clicks through, and it causes people to oversimplify problems. and it allows them to be taken advantage of. So if you look at what's going on in China, they said, well, this is an issue of human rights. This is an issue of free speech. And, the U.S. feels very strongly about this. However, at the same time, Donald Trump is trying to limit press access, and he's attacking the press and, saying that, they're anti-American and that there needs to be controls on this. And the U.S. pulled out of the United Nations human rights and is been accused of their own human rights violations. So everything becomes very convenient at times. When it's China, well, we care about human rights. Oh, we care about this protest. Well, what about the Yellow Jacket protests in France that get very little coverage? It's very apparent that when it comes to China, there's this heightened sense of injustice that it doesn't even always apply in the U.S.
Indeed, and we'll have to leave there as our final word, but of course, appreciate both Jamie and Moundhir for speaking to us. Jamie was speaking to us there from London, and Moundhir was speaking to us there from Dubai, not London, as I had mistakenly said at the beginning. And now this issue of the social media platforms viewers, such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, blocking and suspending pro-quote-unquote China accounts on their respective platforms because of their coverage of the Hong Kong protests and them showing basically things like rioters, violence, and showing the other side, essentially, of this story. It's disturbing because, again, these platforms are now playing sides. They're taking sides. And as I put the example of Hillary Clinton in her statement about U.S. Diplomacy in the internet age through Twitter back in 2009 and what occurred in Iran. And certainly we can probably come up with a gazillion other examples that have occurred since and before through the internet, through Twitter, through Facebook, through YouTube, or otherwise. It's disturbing because, again, these platforms are not allowing the kind of free exchange of ideas that the raison d'etre is actually, that is what it is. They've claimed to allow free speech and to allow free exchange of ideas, but are not allowing it at the same time, are choosing sides, and then are telling people this is still free speech. So it's kind of, ironic and doesn't make sense. It's a total paradox. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation here in Scope, but I'm Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.